Good morning. We have lots to celebrate, lots to think about at Christmas time, and I'm having some issues with it disappearing. We're okay. There we go. We have things that can distract us, like our iPads in front of us. And that's why I think Advent and Christmas are really important times of the year. They help us to refocus and reorient ourselves to what God is doing around us, to what is truly important in our lives. And why do we do this? Well, because there are so many things that can distract us. We get caught up with the things right in front of our face and lose sight of the things beyond, the things of eternal significance and value. For instance, we have these sort of red cup wars, as they have been called. What should be written on a holiday cup? Should we use the term Happy Holidays or Merry Christmas? There we go. It has been spoken. But I would also add that if we're only thinking about Christmas and we forget about Advent, we miss out on other holy days, which the word holiday actually comes from two words, holy day. It's a reminder that there is more. There's also this question about whether we should use this abbreviation, Xmas. Some people have some issue with that. But just to give you a little background, X is actually the first letter of Christos, which we call Christ, in Greek. And that's where the X comes from. So it's kind of like saying, if we were in English, just calling it CMAS. So that becomes our Christmas. Then the other thing that often distracts us, I think, is the shopping that happens. This is an image from Black Friday, which obviously is a bit of a pandemonium, although I will say I do enjoy that Amazon allows me to skip the stores and just shop easily online. But this can very much distract us if we spend all of our time going through our Christmas list of what we're going to buy and don't spend our time orienting ourselves towards Jesus. This is why in Advent we take some time to reorient ourselves. We get our minds focused on what God's purposes have been throughout the generations. And this is why we also need Christmas, to celebrate what God was beginning to do in Jesus, so that we might experience that more and more throughout our lives. The text from Psalm 89 we just heard sets us back on this eternal trajectory. And it sets the stage for us to anticipate what we are going to celebrate tomorrow. So Psalm 89, it's a bit of a royal psalm. It has a little lament in it, although you didn't hear that today. I'll get back to that in a moment. But it takes us back into a pre-Jesus world, when this text was read as part of Jewish communities that were anticipating the coming of the Messiah. They saw God's covenant promise to the people of God coming as a king who would rule on the throne of David forever, and that would be fulfilled in the Messiah. The writer of the psalm reminds us of that in the first few lines, with the promise and the covenant that came with it. As we dig into this text, I hope that will become clear. But before I talk about covenants, and I will put in a little plug for the Bible Project, if you're ever online, they have a great video on the covenants of God, but I'll give you a short refresher in case you need it. So there was many covenants between God and God's people throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament. But they carried one similar message throughout all of them. I will be your God, and you will be my people. In this way, a covenant is not just a contract. It's not something that we sign on the dotted line, but it's a relational agreement between God and God's people. And it's something that set God's people apart from the other people around them, from their gods who demanded sacrifice, from their gods, and I'm saying the small g God here. Their gods would desire terrible things of them to be appeased. But our God, Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, was different in that the people always knew that God had a special place for them. It emphasized this great connection. And two of the words that are used in this very verse and several times throughout Psalm 89 is your steadfast love and your faithfulness. These are really important, and we see these lived out too in the Christmas story. Now, steadfast is a word we probably don't hear very often. Has anybody used that, say, in the last week or two? No? Not even our Bible professors. Well, it's a word that when paired with love, it adds this love that is completely and intentionally focused on the other without wavering. In our English language, the word love is kind of watered down. We might say, I love pizza, or I love to play board games, or I love this band. But we would also say, I love my family, I love my friends, I love my church. And these all have different meanings, and that's why it's really important that our translators put that word steadfast in there, so that we don't get this false sense that love is just something little, something inconsequential. It's more like saying, I like this, or I prefer this. It's this deep connection, and that is how God feels about us. In John's gospel, we hear, for God so loved the world. The reason for Christmas, the reason for all of this, is the love of God in flesh. And faithfulness, that's the other key word there. It's obviously an enduring commitment. Now, if you think back to the covenants that God made, there was this one covenant with Abraham. Now, this gets a little gory, so I apologize, but it's in our Bible, so I got to tell it. So, with Abraham, he made this covenant where they would cut the animals in half. Not small animals, large animals. Cut them in half and lay them on either side. And that the whole point was that you would walk through together, or the subservient one would walk through, saying basically, if I break the covenant, may I be like these animals. That's the significance of that action. It was a pretty significant way to make an agreement between God and God's people. But in the story, it's not Abraham, the representative of God's people, walking through. It actually ended up being God. And in that, God is saying, I will be faithful no matter what. Even when they are falling asleep on the sidelines, I will be faithful to my people. This is an experience unlike any religious group, and we see it again lived out in Jesus. Jesus came to the earth. Jesus lived a good life. Jesus cared and loved and served. And then what happened? Crucifixion. The most utterly embarrassing and painful way to go. And yet, God again said, I will be faithful, and raised Jesus. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself now. Let's get back to the Christmas story before we get too far. So, in the next verses that we experience in Psalm 89, we hear of this king. Now, it's talked about as David. He was seen as this very luxurious king and seen as the best king that Israel could experience. And in some ways, Psalm 89 is a retelling of his reign. But more profoundly, it becomes an image of who the Messiah will be, the king that will follow after David. See, the first thing that it moves us towards is this Messiah, who we know to be Jesus. Plain carpenter's son, nothing fancy about him. But he was of David's line. And in a way, Jesus was meant to be the ultimate David, the David as he should have been. They share in common some realities. They were both anointed. We see in verse 20 that he was anointed with holy oil, something that was done of those called to a special role, like priests and kings. It set them apart under God's protection and service. But then it starts to go beyond what David would actually do. In verse 21, it talks about God's hand being upon this king, which meant that God was transferring the power and ruling ability. The Messiah would do the work of God. In verses 22 and 24, there's a sense of victory over our enemies. Now, we might read that now and think, ooh, that makes me uncomfortable. We Mennonites don't really like this idea of violence too much. But in this story, we see that it's not violence that people are called to do against other people. It's rather that God is going to make things right. I think we read our own story, our own insecurities into those verses. But it instead says, I will trust that God will make things right. Verse 25 talks about the Messiah having his hand over the sea. Now, in his day, the sea would have been a place of chaos. So having his hand on the sea in figurative and literal ways, as we would see in Jesus' life, would be this time in which things were calm and things were put back to order. Finally, in verse 26, we see that there's this father-son relationship going on. No longer is it a lord to a king, but it is a father and a son working together for the same purposes. This would be the kind of king that perhaps the people of Israel were waiting for, at least should have been. But the question as to why God would go to all this trouble, that often plagues me. Why would God go to all this trouble? Couldn't God just snap his fingers and make it happen? But that's not how this works. That's not how God chooses to work, because God lives out of this steadfast love that is without end. Our God is not content to leave us in meaningless brokenness and suffering. Our God desires to see love felt by God's people and spread throughout the world, so that the brokenness would not remain that way, but it would find healing, so that hope would return to the world, so that love could be felt by all. What we didn't hear in the scripture that was read were the verses 38 to 52, where the author of the psalm laments God not actually showing God's love. And I think this is a lot like when we get distracted by red cups and happy holidays versus Merry Christmas and the shopping list that we just need to get done. We get stuck on the things that are right in front of us, and we forget the eternal reality of God's love. The author writes, "Where is your steadfast love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David?" How quickly we can turn on God, that we let our circumstances erase the good that we know. At Christmas time, we can choose to fall into these debates over red cups, or we can greet each other in a different way. We can focus on our calling as a church to love our neighbor, to love our enemies, to love our God as we love ourselves. And so I pose this to you. Let us allow Christmas to be a reminder of God's love that reorients us to love those around us. And as you read the Christmas story or hear it tonight at our Christmas Eve service, I invite you to look for those moments in which you see God expressing that radical love to you and yours, and even to those whom you might not expect. May God help us to love one another.